The story isn't that small businesses in New York suddenly forgot how to run themselves. The story is that the economic environment they're operating in has become systematically hostile, and that didn't happen by accident. When people say, the governor is facing fallout, what they really mean is this: the costs of governing choices are finally landing where they always land in a capitalist economy, on the smallest, weakest firms with the least bargaining power. Start with the basic mechanism. Small businesses live and die on thin margins. They don't have pricing power. They don't have legal teams. They don't have access to cheap credit. When rents rise, they can't negotiate like multinational chains. When interest rates spike, they don't refinance on favorable terms. When labor costs rise, they can't spread those costs across hundreds of locations. That's not ideology. That's arithmetic. Now look at New York. Commercial rents remain elevated, especially in and around New York City. Energy costs are high. Insurance premiums are up. Food and wholesale input prices surged during inflation and never fully came back down. At the same time, higher interest rates tightened credit. Banks lend less readily to small firms because, from the bank's point of view, small businesses are risky and disposable. The result is a squeeze from all sides. Here's where the state comes in. Under Kathy Hochul, New York has largely chosen continuity over disruption. That means protecting bond ratings, maintaining business confidence among large employers, and keeping the state attractive to finance, real estate, and large corporate players. Those goals aren't neutral. They come with trade-offs. When the state prioritizes fiscal stability defined by Wall Street, it limits how aggressive it's willing to be in rent control for commercial tenants, public banking alternatives, or large-scale relief targeted at small firms. So what happens? Costs are socialized downward. The state avoids fiscal risk. Large corporations absorb price shocks or pass them on. Small businesses absorb them directly, until they can't. When a neighborhood restaurant closes or a family-owned shop shuts its doors, it looks like an isolated failure. In reality, it's a predictable outcome of a system designed to let smaller players fail quietly, while larger ones are insulated. Notice what doesn't happen. The governor doesn't stand up and say, "Our economic model depends on churn. Some of you will fail so others can extract stable returns." That would be politically impossible. Instead, we get speeches about resilience, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Language that subtly shifts responsibility back onto the business owner. If you fail, it's because you didn't adapt, didn't pivot, didn't hustle enough. But follow the incentives. State government relies heavily on revenue tied to high earners, financial markets, and real estate valuations. That creates a structural bias. Policies that would meaningfully reduce commercial rents, cap certain fees, or create robust public alternatives to private credit risk, upsetting powerful constituencies. Policies that support small business tend to be temporary grants, tax credits, or pilot programs, helpful at the margins, but nowhere near enough to offset systemic cost pressures. This is why talk of collapse starts to circulate even before the data fully catches up. Small businesses are often the first economic canary. They feel tightening conditions earlier than large firms. Closures in retail and food service aren't random. Those sectors are labor-intensive, rent-sensitive, and extremely exposed to fluctuations in consumer spending. When they start dropping out, it signals a deeper imbalance. So the political danger for the governor isn't that there's a single policy disaster with her name on it. It's that the accumulated effects of an economic structure she manages, but does not challenge, are becoming visible at street level. Storefronts empty. For lease, signs multiply. Workers lose jobs. And eventually, voters ask a simple question. If the economy is supposedly strong, why does it feel like it's failing where we actually live? To understand how this pressure builds and why it keeps hitting the same people over and over, we need to look more closely at the specific cost drivers pushing small businesses over the edge and who benefits from keeping those drivers in place. That's where we go next. To see why small businesses are failing, you don't start with ideology. You start with the bill: rent, labor, credit, and fees. Those four-line items explain more closures than any culture war argument ever could. And in New York, every one of them has moved in the wrong direction at the same time. Take commercial rent first, because it's the silent killer. Commercial leases in places like New York City are often short-term and volatile. Unlike residential tenants, small businesses have far fewer protections. Landlords can raise rents sharply at renewal, and they do, because they can. Property owners are responding to their own incentives. Higher interest rates on loans, pressure to maintain returns, and the expectation that chains or luxury tenants might eventually replace mom-and-pop shops. Vacancy isn't a crisis for them, it's a bargaining tactic. From the state's perspective, aggressively regulating commercial rents risks angering real estate interests that are deeply embedded in New York's political economy. Property taxes, campaign donations, bond market perceptions, all of that creates a strong incentive for Albany to tread lightly. The result is predictable. Landlords preserve flexibility and pricing power, while small businesses absorb the instability. Next, labor. Wages have risen, and for workers, that's long overdue. But here's the structural problem. When wage increases happen without parallel reductions in rent, debt costs, or healthcare expenses, small employers are forced to shoulder adjustments they didn't cause and can't control. Large corporations can automate, outsource, or absorb costs across scale. Small businesses can't. They either raise prices, risking customers, or cut hours, cut staff, or close. Now add credit. High interest rates didn't just cool inflation, they froze access to capital for small firms. Banks tightened lending standards after regional banking stress, and guess who gets cut off first? Not the corporations issuing bonds, not the real estate developers with collateral. It's the cafe owner, the auto shop, the daycare center. Without affordable credit, short-term shocks become fatal. A bad quarter isn't a setback, it's the end. State government could intervene here with public banking options or more aggressive credit guarantees, but that would mean competing with private finance or accepting more public risk. Under Kathy Hochul, New York has largely avoided that path. Instead, the state leans on private lenders to do what private lenders, by design, do not want to do: lend cheaply to risky borrowers. When that doesn't happen, the failure is framed as market reality, not policy choice. Then there are fees, compliance costs, and administrative burdens. Licensing, insurance mandates, energy costs, delivery platform commissions, each one defensible on its own, each one small enough to seem manageable. Together, they function like a regressive tax. Big firms hire compliance departments. Small firms hire accountants and lawyers they can barely afford, or they make mistakes and pay penalties. Again, structure matters. Notice the pattern. None of these pressures are temporary, none are freak accidents. They are built into how New York's economy is organized and governed. The state prioritizes stability for capital and revenue reliability for government. Small businesses exist in the leftover space, expected to be flexible, innovative, and resilient. Code words for "you'll absorb the shock." This is why closures cluster in certain sectors and neighborhoods. It's not about bad management, it's about exposure. Restaurants, retail, personal services, these businesses sit at the intersection of high rent, high labor intensity, and low margins. When costs rise across the board, they fall first. And politically, this creates a slow-burning problem. Governors don't get blamed for individual closures. They get blamed when the pattern becomes visible, when people notice that the economy works fine for banks, landlords, and large employers, but not for the places that anchor daily life. At that point, the question shifts from what went wrong to who is this system actually designed to protect? Answering that question requires looking at who doesn't feel this squeeze and why. That's the next step. If you want to understand why the system stays this way, look at who is insulated from the damage. Capital doesn't just survive these conditions, it often benefits from them. That's not a moral claim. It's a structural one. Start with large corporations and chains. When small competitors close, market share doesn't disappear. It consolidates. National retailers, franchise restaurants, and platform-based services step into the gaps left behind. They negotiate long-term leases at better rates. They borrow at lower costs. They spread risk across regions. In an environment where small businesses are squeezed, scale becomes an advantage. and consolidation accelerates. Now look at landlords. Commercial real estate owners often prefer a period of vacancy to locking in lower rents. A closed storefront isn't necessarily a loss if it preserves future pricing power. In fact, closures can strengthen the landlord's hand by resetting expectations. This is why you can see entire blocks with empty retail space and rising asking rents at the same time. The property is still an appreciating asset, and the owner's balance sheet matters more than the neighborhood's vitality. Finance benefits too. High interest rates mean higher returns on lending and safer yields on government debt. Banks reduce exposure to small business lending not because it's unprofitable in absolute terms, but because it's less attractive relative to other options. The state, reliant on financial sector health and bond market confidence, has a built-in incentive to avoid policies that would disrupt those flows. This is the context in which Kathy Hochul governs. Her administration emphasizes fiscal responsibility, investment attraction, and stability. Translated into material outcomes, that means avoiding confrontations with real estate, finance, and large employers. These actors are framed as job creators and tax base anchors. Small businesses are celebrated rhetorically, but treated as interchangeable. Here's the quiet truth. From the standpoint of state revenue, losing 10 small businesses hurts far less than losing one major corporate taxpayer. That calculus doesn't make headlines, but it shapes policy priorities. When budgets are tight, relief flows upward to sectors deemed systemically important. Everyone else gets press releases and pilot programs. The political economy logic is ruthless but coherent. A churn of small businesses is tolerable, even useful, because it keeps wages disciplined, rents high, and markets competitive for those with capital. Failure is reframed as entrepreneurial risk rather than structural outcome. The system cleanses itself, and policymakers avoid direct responsibility. This also explains why the fallout feels delayed. Closures happen quietly, one by one. There's no single crash, no dramatic moment, just a steady erosion. Workers find new jobs, often at lower wages or worse conditions. Consumers adapt. The pain is dispersed. That diffusion protects political leadership until it doesn't. Eventually, the effects concentrate. Fewer local employers, less neighborhood stability, more dependence on chains and platforms. When that happens at scale, it becomes visible enough to enter politics. Suddenly, the question isn't why one cafe closed, but why entire districts feel hollowed out. And this is where the governor's vulnerability lies, not in a single policy failure, but in presiding over an economic structure that systematically favors capital concentration while claiming to support small enterprise. When voters connect those dots, the language of strong fundamentals stops working. To see how this tension translates into political risk and why it's starting to matter now, we need to look at timing, interest rates, post-pandemic adjustments, and the narrowing space for denial. That's where we turn next. Timing is everything here. The reason this pressure is surfacing now, politically, not just economically, is because several protective buffers have disappeared at the same time. For a few years, small businesses were surviving on fumes, pandemic relief, eviction moratoriums, ultra-low interest rates, and a temporary surge in consumer spending. That scaffolding is gone. Start with interest rates. When the Federal Reserve raised rates aggressively to fight inflation, it didn't just cool demand. It rewired the entire risk landscape. Cheap money vanished. Refinancing became harder. Variable rate loans reset upward. For a small business already operating on thin margins, that shift alone can turn a manageable situation into a terminal one. The lag effect matters here. Closures show up months, even years after the policy change. At the same time, pandemic-era supports expired. Emergency grants ran out. Deferred rent came due. Tax obligations resumed. During COVID, the state could plausibly claim that extraordinary times required extraordinary measures. Now normalcy has returned, but the underlying cost structure is worse than before. Businesses are expected to operate as if conditions are stable, even though the ground beneath them has shifted. Consumer behavior also changed. Spending moved toward services and experiences, but it also became more price-sensitive. Households squeezed by rent, healthcare, and debt cut back where they can. Small businesses, especially in discretionary sectors, feel that immediately. A slight drop in foot traffic can mean the difference between survival and closure. This is where the political narrative starts to fray. State leadership, including Kathy Hochul, points to headline indicators: job growth, GDP, investment announcements. And those numbers aren't fake. They're just incomplete. Aggregate data can look strong while distributional realities deteriorate. That's the contradiction voters experience directly. They hear the economy is doing well while watching familiar storefronts disappear. The post-pandemic period also narrowed the space for excuses. Supply chain disruptions? Mostly resolved. Emergency conditions? Officially over. At this stage, persistent failure starts to look less like bad luck and more like design. That's when accountability creeps in, even if it's diffuse and unorganized. Politically, this creates an asymmetry. Governors benefit from good macro news quickly. They pay for structural weaknesses slowly. There's no ribbon cutting for a business that didn't close, no press conference for a loan that was never approved. The costs accumulate invisibly until they don't. New York's particular vulnerability is its cost profile. High rent, high labor costs, high fees, high taxes, justified individually, punishing collectively. In boom times, that model works because growth covers inefficiency. In tighter conditions, it becomes brittle. Small businesses are the first to crack because they lack buffers. And here's the key point: none of this requires malicious intent. A governor can sincerely support small businesses and still preside over their decline if the structural incentives run the other way. The system rewards caution toward capital and indifference toward churn at the bottom. Stability for investors is treated as synonymous with stability for everyone else, even when evidence suggests otherwise. As these pressures converge, the political risk isn't an opposition attack or a single scandal. It's a credibility gap. People start asking whether leadership understands the economy as lived, not just as measured. Once that doubt sets in, it's hard to reverse with talking points alone. The remaining question is what options actually exist. Are there alternative policy paths that could shift the burden away from constant small business failure? Or is this simply the accepted cost of doing business in a state organized around high-end capital? That's the final issue we need to confront. So the question at the end of all this is not whether small businesses can be saved in the abstract. It's whether the state is willing to change the rules that make their failure routine. Because if nothing structural changes, the pattern we're seeing isn't a crisis, it's equilibrium. There are policy alternatives. They're not mysterious, and they're not radical by historical standards. Commercial rent stabilization, longer mandatory lease terms, or limits on sudden rent spikes would immediately reduce the single largest cost pressure facing small firms. Public or quasi-public banking options could provide credit insulated from profit maximization cycles. Targeted tax relief tied to employment and local ownership could shift incentives away from consolidation. None of this requires innovation. It requires confrontation. And that's the obstacle. Each of those moves redistributes power away from landlords, large financial institutions, and dominant corporations. That redistribution is precisely what current governance avoids. Under Kathy Hochul, the state has signaled repeatedly that it wants to be a safe, predictable environment for capital. From the standpoint of bond markets and major investors, that's a success. From the standpoint of small business survival, it's a liability. This is the political bind. You cannot simultaneously maximize returns for capital and minimize failure among small, undercapitalized firms. One of those goals has to give. The rhetoric of supporting small business tries to paper over that contradiction, but material outcomes expose it. When storefronts empty out while corporate profits and asset values remain strong, people notice. The likely future, absent change, is more consolidation. Fewer independent businesses, more chains, more platform-mediated commerce. Neighborhoods become consumption zones rather than economic communities. Employment becomes more precarious, less rooted, and more dependent on large employers with leverage over wages and conditions. That trajectory isn't accidental. It's how capitalist systems resolve pressure when left to their own logic. For the governor, the risk isn't immediate collapse. It's slow delegitimization. Voters may not articulate it in structural terms, but they experience it as loss. Fewer local options, weaker community ties, jobs that feel interchangeable. At some point, leadership is judged not by macro indicators, but by whether everyday economic life feels viable. The deeper lesson here goes beyond any one administration. Small businesses are often romanticized as engines of opportunity, but they're treated in practice as expendable. They absorb shocks so larger actors don't have to. They provide flexibility to the system at the cost of their own stability. When they fail, it's framed as natural selection rather than policy outcome. If New York continues down this path, the question won't be why small businesses collapsed. The answer will already be obvious. The real question will be why anyone was surprised.